Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight, we journey to a quiet corner of history where a soft metallic shimmer drifts through dimly lit workshops and ancient chambers. Moving like a slow ripple of water under lantern light, I trace its presence gently, feeling the way it glows in still air and settles into the folds of time. So, before your dreams take over, gently like the video and subscribe, only if this brought you peace. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. The story of Mercury is one of those quiet historical epics where nothing seems too dramatic at first glance. It's just a metal after all, shiny, silvery, and with the deeply suspicious habit of remaining liquid, even when everything else around it politely solidifies. People noticed this odd trait thousands of years ago, and instead of running in the opposite direction as any sensible creature might, they reacted with the enthusiasm of a toddler discovering a new toy. They touched it, played with it, heated it, drank it, inhaled it, rubbed it on their skin, and of course prescribed it medicinally. Because humanity has always had a remarkable talent for misunderstanding which substances belong inside the human body. Mercury wasn't rare in the ancient world. It seeped from the earth in red veins of cinnabar, mercury sulfide, whose rich scarlet color was irresistible to early artists and priests. Before anyone melted cinnabar down into liquid metal, they ground it into pigment. In ancient Anatolia, China, Rome, and beyond, the powder decorated tombs, statues, and skin. It was the color of blood, which people assumed meant it was connected to life force. Unfortunately, it was also connected to the somewhat less romantic concept of poisoning. But ancient people had bigger concerns, like staying alive long enough to complain. The Chinese were among the earliest societies to use mercury in a systematic way. Cinnabar appeared in burial chambers as early as the Neolithic period. Over time, the Chinese fascination with mercury drifted into alchemy, which, in their case, was a surprisingly practical field. They didn't always attempt to create actual immortality so much as better medicines, or at least substances that looked like medicines. Mercury slipped into a wide variety of early concoctions, largely because it was rare, shiny, and difficult to handle. Somehow these traits convinced people that it must be valuable for health. It is unclear who started that rumor. History has declined to leave us a name, possibly out of embarrassment. By the time of the Qin dynasty, the association between mercury and immortality had strengthened. The infamous Emperor Qin Shi Huang, who unified China and launched the Great Wall's early construction, reportedly consumed mercury-laced elixirs in his desperate search for eternal life. The result was, naturally, the opposite of eternal life. But the emperor left behind one of history's most magnificent tomb complexes, its rivers supposedly simulated with flowing mercury. Modern tests have detected elevated mercury levels in the soil around the sealed chamber, suggesting the ancient constructors weren't joking. If the tomb is ever opened, something archaeologists hesitate to do for many reasons, it may turn out to be one of the world's earliest mercury hazards, waiting patiently beneath a mound of earth. The Greeks and Romans inherited many of these ideas about mercury's power. They didn't pursue immortality quite as enthusiastically, though they did dabble in alchemy, which was basically ancient chemistry mixed with philosophical optimism. Mercury fascinated them because it blurred boundaries. It was neither fully metal nor non-metal. It shifted shape freely. Aristotle, who rarely met a classification he didn't want to complicate, wrote about substances that sat between states, and mercury fit that category neatly. Roman doctors, always eager to experiment, used mercury in small doses for various ailments. They believed it could purge the body of impurities, a concept that endured far longer than it probably should have. Roman miners, meanwhile, had a less glamorous relationship with Mercury. The mines at Almaden in Spain, which would later become notorious for centuries of toxic labor, were already known in antiquity. Workers extracted cinnabar and heated it to release elemental mercury. The fumes, which modern readers can immediately identify as catastrophic, were simply part of the job. Ancient sources vaguely noted that mining cinnabar was unhealthy, which is an impressively understated way of acknowledging widespread neurological damage. But understatement was a Roman specialty, especially when discussing the working conditions of people they didn't consider fully important. As time drifted forward, Mercury slipped into medieval and early modern alchemy, like a recurring character in a very long, very confusing series. Alchemists believed all metals were variations of the same underlying substance, shaped into different forms by impurities or cosmic forces, depending on which book you were reading. Mercury was considered one of the prime substances, fluid and volatile, the embodiment of transformation. To an alchemist, Mercury wasn't just a chemical, it was a philosophical idea. It symbolized the ability to shift from one state to another, mirroring the hoped-for transformation of base metals into gold. This symbolism made Mercury indispensable in alchemical laboratories. It appeared in distillations, tinctures, and transmutation experiments. The alchemists heated it, mixed it with sulfur, sealed it in glass containers, shook it, and generally treated it like the world's least responsible science fair project. Many alchemists, unsurprisingly, developed symptoms consistent with mercury exposure, tremors, mood swings, erratic behavior, but since they were already engaged in eccentric pursuits, no one saw anything unusual. Then came the early modern period, when the obsession with mercury took on a more medical tone. European physicians rediscovered ancient Roman practices and doubled down on them with gusto. Mercury compounds, especially calomel, were prescribed for everything from constipation to syphilis. If a patient was sweating, salivating excessively, or shedding layers of skin, the doctor would often consider the treatment a success. The prevailing medical theory assumed that effective treatments should produce visible reactions, and mercury certainly did that. During the Renaissance, mercury made its way into art studios as well. Vermilion, derived from cinnabar, was one of the most prized pigments. It produced a brilliant red, unmatched by other natural sources. Artists, naturally, used it enthusiastically, often grinding it by hand. This process released fine dust that drifted into workshops and lungs. But the results were beautiful, and beauty has always won out over health in the art world. As a result, the same pigment that adorned emperors' tombs in ancient China now decorated European altarpieces, frescoes, and manuscripts, a remarkably consistent use across millennia, with equally consistent hazards. Mercury's influence spread further during the global age of exploration. European powers eager to extract silver from the Americas adopted a refining technique involving mercury amalgamation. At Potosi, in modern Bolivia, the Spanish supervised enormous operations where indigenous laborers used mercury to separate silver from ore. The scale was staggering. Mercury was shipped across oceans by the ton, and entire watersheds became contaminated. Workers developed neurological symptoms, sometimes described in colonial reports with a kind of detached curiosity. The silver wealth of Spain flowed through the hands of people slowly being poisoned, and the empire's treasure ships glittered with a cost rarely acknowledged in their time. As centuries continued drifting by, Mercury found its way into professions that seem almost comically unfortunate in hindsight. Hat makers, for example, used mercury nitrate to treat felt during the making of high-quality hats. Prolonged exposure caused tremors and personality changes, leading to the phrase, "mad as a hatter." While the phrase is often associated with Lewis Carroll's character, the real hatters experienced symptoms far less whimsical. Historical accounts describe shaking hands, irritability, and cognitive decline. Yet the industry continued using mercury well into the 19th century because the technique worked and fashion waits for no one, not even workers losing their coordination. Mercury also became a mainstay of early scientific instruments. Barometers, thermometers, and various laboratory gadgets relied on it because it was stable, dense, and precise. Scientists knew it was dangerous, but scientific curiosity has always required a certain tolerance for risk. The same metal that destroyed miners' health helped launch modern atmospheric science and thermometry. If history has a sense of irony, mercury seems to be its favorite punchline. By the 18th century, mercury was everywhere, on pallets, in pills, in mines, in laboratories, in hat shops. It poisoned workers, patients, and entire ecosystems, yet remained beloved. If you were an early modern physician, you practically needed mercury to feel legitimate. If you were a miner, you encountered it daily. If you were an artist, it might be under your fingernails. If you were royalty, you might be ingesting it under the impression that it was helping your complexion. It's difficult, from a modern perspective, not to view this with gentle disbelief. But the people of the past weren't foolish. They simply operated with the best understanding they had, mixed with a good deal of human optimism. And mercury, with its mesmerizing shine and seemingly magical properties, was very easy to believe in. A substance that moved like water, but gleamed like metal. Of course it had to be powerful. Of course it had to be helpful. Humanity has always leaned toward the impressive, often at its own expense. As the 19th century crept in, mercury's reputation grew more complicated. Industrialization magnified its hazards. Factories used mercury compounds for dyes, explosives, and electrical equipment. Medical use remained common, though increasingly questioned. Some physicians noted that mercury treatments sometimes made patients worse, but medicine, like all traditions, was slow to change. And in royal courts across Europe, discreet whispers circulated about rulers whose health deteriorated after treatments involving mercury. Some cases were documented, others speculative but widely believed. It was not unusual for elites to undergo health regimens that mixed luxury with toxicity, opulent diets, questionable tonics, and occasionally heavy metals. Mercury drifted into these routines with the same quiet persistence it had shown since antiquity. By the time the 20th century arrived, mercury had managed to embed itself into nearly every corner of society. It would take decades more before regulations curtailed its use. Yet, even as its dangers became undeniable, mercury remained strangely stubbornly part of the world's daily life. A liquid reminder that history's most enduring hazards are often the ones that shimmer. The story of Mercury is one of those quiet, historical epics where nothing seems too dramatic at first glance. It's just a metal, after all, shiny, silvery, and with the deeply suspicious habit of remaining liquid, even when everything else around it politely solidifies. People noticed this odd trait thousands of years ago, and instead of running in the opposite direction as any sensible creature might, they reacted with the enthusiasm of a toddler discovering a new toy. They touched it, played with it, heated it, drank it, inhaled it, rubbed it on their skin, and of course prescribed it medicinally, because humanity has always had a remarkable talent for misunderstanding which substances belong inside the human body. Mercury wasn't rare in the ancient world. It seeped from the earth in red veins of cinnabar, mercury sulfide, whose rich scarlet color was irresistible to early artists and priests. Before anyone melted cinnabar down into liquid metal, they ground it into pigment. In ancient Anatolia, China, Rome and beyond, the powder decorated tombs, statues and skin. It was the color of blood, which people assumed meant it was connected to life force. Unfortunately, it was also connected to the somewhat less romantic concept of poisoning. But ancient people had bigger concerns, like staying alive long enough to complain. The Chinese were among the earliest societies to use mercury in a systematic way. Cinnabar appeared in burial chambers as early as the Neolithic period. Over time, the Chinese fascination with mercury drifted into alchemy, which in their case was a surprisingly practical field. They didn't always attempt to create actual immortality so much as better medicines, or at least substances that looked like medicines. Mercury slipped into a wide variety of early concoctions, largely because it was rare, shiny, and difficult to handle. Somehow, these traits convinced people that it must be valuable for health. It is unclear who started that rumor. History has declined to leave us a name, possibly out of embarrassment. By the time of the Qin dynasty, the association between mercury and immortality had strengthened. The infamous Emperor Qin Shi Huang, who unified China and launched the Great Wall's early construction, reportedly consumed mercury-laced elixirs in his desperate search for eternal life. The result was, naturally, the opposite of eternal life. But the emperor left behind one of history's most magnificent tomb complexes, its rivers supposedly simulated with flowing mercury. Modern tests have detected elevated mercury levels in the soil around the sealed chamber, suggesting the ancient constructors weren't joking. If the tomb is ever opened, something archaeologists hesitate to do for many reasons, it may turn out to be one of the world's earliest mercury hazards, waiting patiently beneath a mound of earth. The Greeks and Romans inherited many of these ideas about Mercury's power. They didn't pursue immortality quite as enthusiastically, though they did dabble in alchemy, which was basically ancient chemistry mixed with philosophical optimism. Mercury fascinated them because it blurred boundaries. It was neither fully metal nor non-metal. It shifted shape freely. Aristotle, who rarely met a classification he didn't want to complicate, wrote about substances that sat between states, and mercury fit that category neatly. Roman doctors, always eager to experiment, used mercury in small doses for various ailments. They believed it could purge the body of impurities, a concept that endured far longer than it probably should have. Roman miners, meanwhile, had a less glamorous relationship with mercury. The mines at Almaden in Spain, which would later become notorious for centuries of toxic labor, were already known in antiquity. Workers extracted cinnabar and heated it to release elemental mercury. The fumes, which modern readers can immediately identify as catastrophic, were simply part of the job. Ancient sources vaguely noted that mining cinnabar was unhealthy, which is an impressively understated way of acknowledging widespread neurological damage. But understatement was a Roman specialty, especially when discussing the working conditions of people they didn't consider fully important. As time drifted forward, mercury slipped into medieval and early modern alchemy like a recurring character in a very long, very confusing series. Alchemists believed all metals were variations of the same underlying substance, shaped into different forms by impurities or cosmic forces, depending on which book you were reading. Mercury was considered one of the prime substances, fluid and volatile, the embodiment of transformation. To an alchemist, Mercury wasn't just a chemical, it was a philosophical idea. It symbolized the ability to shift from one state to another, mirroring the hoped-for transformation of base metals into gold. This symbolism made Mercury indispensable in alchemical laboratories. It appeared in distillations, tinctures, and transmutation experiments. The alchemists heated it, mixed it with sulfur, sealed it in glass containers, shook it, and generally treated it like the world's least responsible science fair project. Many alchemists, unsurprisingly, developed symptoms consistent with mercury exposure: tremors, mood swings, erratic behavior. But since they were already engaged in eccentric pursuits, no one saw anything unusual. Then came the early modern period, when the obsession with mercury took on a more medical tone. European physicians rediscovered ancient Roman practices and doubled down on them with gusto. Mercury compounds, especially calomel, were prescribed for everything from constipation to syphilis. If a patient was sweating, salivating excessively, or shedding layers of skin, the doctor would often consider the treatment a success. The prevailing medical theory assumed that effective treatments should produce visible reactions, and mercury certainly did that. During the Renaissance, mercury made its way into art studios as well. Vermilion, derived from cinnabar, was one of the most prized pigments. It produced a brilliant red, unmatched by other natural sources. Artists naturally used it enthusiastically, often grinding it by hand. This process released fine dust that drifted into workshops and lungs. But the results were beautiful, and beauty has always won out over health in the art world. As a result, the same pigment that adorned emperors' tombs in ancient China now decorated European altarpieces, frescoes, and manuscripts, a remarkably consistent use across millennia, with equally consistent hazards. Mercury's influence spread further during the global age of exploration. European powers, eager to extract silver from the Americas, adopted a refining technique involving mercury amalgamation. At Potosi, in modern Bolivia, the Spanish supervised enormous operations where indigenous laborers used mercury to separate silver from ore. The scale was staggering. Mercury was shipped across oceans by the ton, and entire watersheds became contaminated. Workers developed neurological symptoms, sometimes described in colonial reports with a kind of detached curiosity. The silver wealth of Spain flowed through the hands of people slowly being poisoned, and the empire's treasure ships glittered with a cost rarely acknowledged in their time. Centuries continued drifting by. Mercury found its way into professions that seem almost comically unfortunate in hindsight. Hat makers, for example, used mercury nitrate to treat felt during the making of high-quality hats. Prolonged exposure caused tremors and personality changes, leading to the phrase "mad as a hatter." While the phrase is often associated with Lewis Carroll's character, the real hatters experienced symptoms far less whimsical. Historical accounts describe shaking hands, irritability, and cognitive decline. Yet the industry continued using mercury well into the 19th century because the technique worked and fashion waits for no one, not even workers losing their coordination. Mercury also became a mainstay of early scientific instruments. Barometers, thermometers, and various laboratory gadgets relied on it because it was stable, dense, and precise. Scientists knew it was dangerous, but scientific curiosity has always required a certain tolerance for risk. The same metal that destroyed miners' health helped launch modern atmospheric science and thermometry. If history has a sense of irony, mercury seems to be its favorite punchline. By the 18th century, Mercury was everywhere, on pallets, in pills, in mines, in laboratory, in hat shops. It poisoned workers, patients, and entire ecosystems, yet remained beloved. If you were an early modern physician, you practically needed mercury to feel legitimate. If you were a miner, you encountered it daily. If you were an artist, it might be under your fingernails. If you were royalty, you might be ingesting it under the impression that it was helping your complexion. It's difficult, from a modern perspective, not to view this with gentle disbelief. But the people of the past weren't foolish. They simply operated with the best understanding they had, mixed with a good deal of human optimism. And Mercury, with its mesmerizing shine and seemingly magical properties, was very easy to believe in. A substance that moved like water but gleamed like metal. Of course it had to be powerful. Of course it had to be helpful. Humanity has always leaned toward the impressive, often at its own expense. As the 19th century crept in, Mercury's reputation grew more complicated. Industrialization magnified its hazards. Factories used mercury compounds for dyes, explosives, and electrical equipment. Medical use remained common, though increasingly questioned. Some physicians noted that mercury treatments sometimes made patients worse, but medicine, like all traditions, was slow to change, and in royal courts across Europe, discreet whispers circulated about rulers whose health deteriorated after treatments involving mercury. Some cases were documented, others speculative but widely believed. It was not unusual for elites to undergo health regimens that mixed luxury with toxicity, opulent diets, questionable tonics, and occasionally heavy metals. Mercury drifted into these routines with the same quiet persistence it had shown since antiquity. By the time the 20th century arrived, mercury had managed to embed itself into nearly every corner of society. It would take decades more before regulations curtailed its use. Yet, even as its dangers became undeniable, mercury remained strangely, stubbornly part of the world's daily life, a liquid reminder that history's most enduring hazards are often the ones that shimmer. And despite how deeply mercury had already wormed its way into human life, the 19th century was when things truly began, drifting from curious to catastrophic. Industrialization, that great humming engine of progress, had a habit of taking whatever humanity had been using casually for a few thousand years and applying it on a scale no one had mentally prepared for. If mercury had been a quiet companion in earlier eras, the 19th century turned it into an industrial co-worker, one who never called in sick, never asked for overtime pay, and quietly poisoned everyone in the factory. Mercury was indispensable in dozens of industries, from chlorine production to gold mining. And because it was so easy to atone and so dramatically effective, nobody thought too much about the side effects. Industrialists had a laser-like focus on output, and mercury helped produce output. Any worker who happened to develop tremors or personality changes was typically chalked up to stress or personal weakness. The era's economic optimism was impressive. If you generously redefine optimism as stubborn denial of reality, the hatting industry, in particular, drifted into full-blown mercury dependency. Felt making required animal fur to undergo a process known as carroting, where mercury nitrate was applied to separate the fibers. When heated, the compound released vapor, and the unfortunate hatters inhaled it day after day in poorly ventilated workshops. Symptoms followed slowly, in a staggered, almost polite fashion. At first, there might be a slight tremble in the hands, maybe a little irritability. Over time, the tremors worsened, and workers experienced cognitive changes that were noticeable but rarely discussed openly. The strange thing is that the industry knew something was wrong. There were internal memos, a very generous term for 19th century correspondence, acknowledging unsteadiness among workers. But because fashion demanded felt hats and felt hats demanded mercury, the practice continued. Mercury poisoning drifted into the culture in small ways. Jokes circulated about hatters who shook so badly they had to hire assistants to pour tea for them. It was all grimly humorous. The way people sometimes laugh at something that frightens them, because the alternative is admitting how bad things truly are. Meanwhile, in the world of science, Mercury was enjoying its golden age. Barometers and thermometers, the reliable tools of meteorologists, physicians and physicists, depended on Mercury's density and stability. Laboratories were stocked with jars of it. Students handled it freely, because nothing says valuable educational experience quite like a room full of teenagers rolling liquid metal across wooden desks. Scientific journals did warn about inhaling mercury vapor, but people tended to interpret vapor as steaming clouds rising dramatically from a witch's cauldron, not the stuff slowly evaporating from that open dish in the corner. The 19th century also brought the professionalization of chemistry, along with larger and more sophisticated laboratories. Many chemists lived to old age, but many others did not. Their obituaries sometimes included unhelpfully vague phrases like illness brought on by laboratory work, which could have meant anything from mercury exposure to spontaneous glassware explosion. In an era without modern safety standards, chemical experimentation was essentially a polite dare between colleagues, and mercury, easy to obtain and mesmerizing to behold, was one of the most common laboratory companions. But it wasn't just scientists and hatters who suffered. Royal households, with their long histories of elaborate health regimens, often incorporated mercury into beauty products and treatments. It was not unusual for elite women to apply creams containing mercury chloride to lighten their skin. The effect was subtle at first, paler complexion, smoother appearance, but with sustained use came hair loss, rashes, and nervous system symptoms that were conveniently blamed on nerves, stress, or court politics. There's something strangely fitting about European elites coating themselves in toxic metal to appear more refined. History occasionally writes its own satire. One particularly tragic example comes from the life of Caroline of Brunswick, estranged wife of King George IV. Though she is not definitively documented as a regular user of mercury-laced cosmetics, the fashionable products of her era often contained it, and her contemporaries were known to indulge heavily. Caroline lived in an environment where appearance was everything, and medical advice was, frankly, not. Whatever mixture of cosmetics and treatments nobles used, mercury drifted through many of them, like a quiet, silvery ghost. Mercury also wormed its way into dentistry, another cheerful detail of 19th century life. Early dental fillings often included a mercury-based amalgam. Dentists heated the mixture, packed it into cavities, and assured patients that the mild metallic taste was nothing to worry about. The fillings were durable at least, and much safer than some earlier attempts, which included lead. If there's a spectrum of terrible options, mercury fillings were arguably the least terrible, still firmly located somewhere on the spectrum. As the 19th century slid into the 20th, the tone toward mercury began to shift. Scientific understanding advanced. Toxicology emerged as a real discipline rather than a hobby for people with too much curiosity and too little caution. Reports accumulated documenting tremors, memory problems, and behavioral changes among workers in mines and factories. Doctors observed the effects more carefully, even if many still clung to the old idea of purging the body with mercury-based medicine. Then came the industrial tragedies, clustered outbreaks of poisoning that could not be ignored. In some factories producing scientific instruments, workers handled mercury daily without gloves. They dipped glass tubes into vats of it, relying on skill and experience to avoid spills. But skill does not prevent vapor exposure, and vapor does not announce itself politely. Workers became ill in ways that were impossible to write off as coincidence. One tragic and historically significant case occurred far from Europe. In Japan, the town of Minamata, sitting peacefully along a quiet stretch of coastline, became the site of one of the worst industrial poisonings in modern history. Beginning in the 1930s, a local chemical plant discharged mercury-laden waste into the bay. Residents noticed strange behavior in cats first: tremors, erratic movements, disorientation. Over time, people exhibited similar symptoms: difficulty walking, vision problems, and other neurological effects. The disaster unfolded gradually as mercury accumulated in fish and shellfish. The world learned the name Minamata disease, and the photographs that emerged decades later, families caring for loved ones incapacitated by neurological damage, were haunting. The tragedy forced governments around the world to reconsider industrial practices. It also demonstrated that mercury poisoning wasn't confined to mines, laboratories, or eccentric royal beauty routines. It could seep into communities quietly, without warning, through something as simple as dinner. Strangely, even as the Minamata disaster captured global attention, mercury continued drifting through everyday life. Thermometers still used it. Batteries still used it. Some paints still used it. Pharmacy shelves in certain countries still offered mercury-based antiseptics. Tobacco companies even used small amounts in pesticides applied to tobacco crops, which is a sentence that really tells you everything you need to know about 20th century public health philosophy. Even monarchies continued brushing against mercury in odd ways. Edward VII of Britain, while not directly connected to mercury treatments, lived at a time when high society embraced all sorts of medical fads, including tonics and restoratives that occasionally featured mercury in small doses. European elites of the late 19th century were stuck in a strange transition period. Their doctors were modern enough to understand germs, but traditional enough to prescribe metallic powders when patients looked tired. If nothing else, it made for interesting medical records. Yet, for all the harm it caused, mercury wasn't purely malicious in its applications. Some of its uses were genuinely transformative. Mercury barometers revolutionized weather prediction. Mercury switches enabled early electrical devices. Mercury lamps illuminated streets and factories, extending the workday and possibly contributing to humanity's perpetual sense of being slightly overtired. But Mercury's bright contributions always came with shadows. The same silvery fluid measuring atmospheric pressure might be slowly evaporating into the laboratory air. The same elegant barometer in a ship's cabin might be poisoning the carpenter who made it. Progress, as usual, carried a fine print that most people preferred not to read. By the mid-20th century, public awareness had finally caught up. Mercury was, by all reasonable measures, no longer the charming curiosity of ancient alchemy or Renaissance medicine. It was a regulated toxic material, complete with safety protocols, warning labels, and an army of industrial hygienists, whose job was to make sure nobody left work with involuntary tremors. Society didn't so much defeat mercury as renegotiate the relationship. The metal was still useful, but now at least it came with gloves, ventilation, and the faint scent of government oversight. And yet, despite all the new rules, mercury still lingered in places people didn't expect. In thermometers tucked into bathroom drawers, in antique mirrors backed with mercury amalgam, in museum artifacts with cinnabar pigment. in the soil of ancient mines and the waters of former industrial town. Mercury had spread through millennia of human activity, leaving fingerprints everywhere. Even today, archaeologists studying ancient burial sites sometimes uncover mercury residues in the soil, a faint chemical echo of rituals long ended and emperors long dead. It is a strange thing to consider that a single metal followed humanity through its entire history, simultaneously admired and feared, useful and destructive. Mercury drifted into art, medicine, industry, and royalty, shaping lives without anyone fully grasping the cost. It shimmered beautifully, while quietly unraveling the bodies of those who handled it. And for thousands of years, people trusted it, partly because they didn't know better, and partly because beauty, mystery, and usefulness are powerful persuaders. And so, Mercury slipped from one century into the next, carrying the same contradictions it had always held. Useful, dangerous, mesmerizing, toxic. Humanity was learning slowly how to live with the liquid metal without letting it undo us. But the learning curve was long, and the history it left behind was even longer. And as Mercury continued drifting deeper into the 20th century, it achieved something few other elements have managed. It became both a scientific staple and a cultural character. People had known it for thousands of years, used it in everything from medicine to magic, yet somehow it still carried an air of mystery, even as regulations tightened and warnings multiplied. Mercury held on to its identity as the shimmering trickster of the periodic table. It was beautiful, dangerous, and endlessly adaptable, qualities that, historically speaking, have always made humans behave unwisely. By the early 20th century, Mercury was embedded in industrial processes in a way that felt almost permanent. Chloralkali plants depended on mercury cells to produce caustic soda, which meant the metal sat at the center of water purification, paper production, and textile manufacturing. Mercury wasn't just a tool anymore, it was infrastructure. Replacing it would require massive overhauls, and industrialists were famously not fond of massive overhauls. You could show them studies about worker tremors and environmental contamination, and they would nod gravely while quietly looking for cheaper alternatives to doing anything. In laboratories, Mercury remained a favorite. Chemists trusted its reliability. Meteorologists trusted its precision. Physicists trusted its predictability. It was the one element you could count on to behave the way it was supposed to, unless you inhaled it, in which case it became significantly less cooperative. Scientific journals continued publishing articles that, in hindsight, read like a slow-motion warning. Researchers noted neurological symptoms, kidney issues, and coordination problems among people working with mercury regularly. But because science culture rewarded results more than safety, the information often lived quietly in footnotes and specialist circles. Meanwhile, in the realm of medicine, mercury refused to retire gracefully. Some physicians continued prescribing calomel and other mercury-based treatments well into the early 20th century. The doses became smaller, the claims more restrained, but the metal still lurked in cabinets and clinics, a leftover from an era when remedies were expected to be mildly terrifying. In the United States, it wasn't until the early 1900s that organized medical associations began actively discouraging mercury use. Even then, it lingered in certain proprietary remedies marketed with the subtlety of a carnival barker. Royal households, with their enduring enthusiasm for health fads, remained entangled in Mercury's orbit in small but persistent ways. Even though most European courts by the 20th century had access to modern medical expertise, old habits have a way of sticking around, especially in families that had been doing things the same way since the Middle Ages. Cosmetic creams continued to contain mercury chloride for whitening purposes. Mercury-laced soaps promised to brighten the skin, a claim that was technically true in a short-term chemically abrasive sort of way. Aristocratic vanities have always been durable, and mercury had long been in their toolkit. But the 20th century was also the era when Mercury's darker side became impossible to ignore. The Minamata disaster, unfolding over decades, served as a global turning point. Mercury poisoning was no longer an occupational hazard or a medical misadventure. It was a community-wide catastrophe. Families living on the edge of the bay found their world quietly unraveling. Adults developed difficulty walking or speaking. Children were born with neurological impairments. The local wildlife exhibited strange behavior, long before humans realized something was profoundly wrong. It took years for authorities to acknowledge the cause, and even longer for meaningful action to occur. But once the scale became undeniable, Minamata forced policymakers worldwide to rethink industrial mercury use. Scientists analyzed the long-term effects of methyl mercury, the organic form that accumulates in fish, and realized that mercury contamination was both persistent and mobile. It entered the food chain, traveled through ecosystems, and did not politely stay where humans had put it. This idea that mercury could travel invisibly, quietly, across boundaries, wasn't actually new. Historians already knew that ancient Roman mines in Spain had contaminated the surrounding environment for centuries. Medieval alchemists accidentally poisoned their laboratories, and sometimes their neighborhood. Early modern silver refineries polluted rivers across South America. But Minamata made the pattern visible on a scale no one could downplay. It was as though Mercury's entire historical resume suddenly appeared all at once, condensed into a single tragedy. After Minamata, global attitudes shifted. The metal that had once symbolized transformation and immortality became a symbol of industrial negligence. Regulators introduced limits and bans. Factories transitioned away from mercury-based processes. Scientific labs upgraded their safety standards. Hatters, thankfully, no longer used mercury at all, mostly because hats had gone out of fashion, but also because modern health codes strongly preferred workers not to shake involuntarily. Yet even as mercury retreated from some industries, it quietly persisted in others. It remained in fluorescent lamps, because nothing in the world seems to glow quite like a little mercury under the right conditions. It stayed in artisanal gold mining, especially in parts of Africa and South America, where miners used mercury to extract gold from ore. These were small operations by global standards, but the cumulative impact was enormous. Mercury drifted through rivers and soil, just as it always had. A miner with a bowl of slurry and a small vial of mercury was participating in a ritual older than most nations. In some ways, the persistence of mercury in gold mining offered a direct historical echo of Spanish silver extraction centuries earlier. Swap the metal, keep the technique, and you have nearly the same environmental story playing out under different skies. It's another reminder that human behavior tends to move in circles rather than straight lines. Even in households, mercury hadn't disappeared completely. For most of the 20th century, millions of people still kept mercury thermometers in their medicine cabinets, shaking them briskly like miniature metal rattles. Children in school science classes were sometimes allowed to touch small droplets poured carefully onto trays. The metal rolled beautifully, merging and separating like a tiny, reflective organism. Teachers would warn students not to touch too much, which of course made students want to touch it even more. Curiosity has always been Mercury's greatest enabler. By the 1970s and 80s, environmental scientists began to measure mercury levels globally, and the results were surprising. Minute traces of the metal were found in places far from industry: Arctic snow, remote mountain lakes, deep ocean layers. Some of it had been released by natural processes like volcanic eruptions, but much of it was undeniably human in origin. Mercury vapor drifted on winds and rainfall, settling in ecosystems thousands of miles away from the factories that emitted it. The world had effectively become one giant linked environment, and mercury, with its talent for movement, was one of the earliest substances to reveal that fact. The irony was that mercury had unintentionally demonstrated the limits of national borders. Countries could regulate their factories, but the atmosphere answered to no one. The metal's mobility made it both a scientific challenge and a political one. International treaties emerged slowly, carefully worded agreements designed to reduce mercury emissions, phase out certain uses, and remediate contaminated sites. But treaties move with the speed of diplomacy, which is to say, not quickly. By the early 21st century, the scientific understanding of mercury had reached a level that would have baffled ancient alchemists. Researchers could trace isotopes, measure microscopic concentrations, and model global pathways. They understood mercury's behavior in air, water, soil, and living organisms. They knew how it transformed chemically, where it accumulated, and how it harmed the nervous system. And yet, despite all this knowledge, humanity still couldn't seem to completely let go of the metal. Its uses had dwindled, but not vanished. Some industries clung to it stubbornly because the alternatives were expensive. Some medical products still contained mercury-based preservatives. Some cultural practices relied on mercury in ritual or traditional remedies. The world was full of people who understood that mercury was dangerous, but continued using it anyway, because it was familiar. If mercury has taught anything over the centuries, it's that humans are remarkably persistent creatures. We cling to habits long after they've proven harmful. We seek beauty even when it comes with risk. We follow tradition even when it carries a cost. Mercury, shimmering and elusive, appeals to all these tendencies. It's no wonder the relationship lasted so long. And in the background of all this, alchemy, medicine, industry, tragedy, regulation, mercury remained exactly what it had always been: a liquid metal drifting between states, behaving according to natural laws that never cared about human desires. The story of mercury is really a story of us, told through the choices we made about a substance that tempted us at every turn. Which brings us to one of history's most striking scenes, a sort of global tableau in which mercury found itself playing roles it never auditioned for. It drifted through royal courts and laboratories, through mines and marketplaces, through rivers and cloud banks, all without changing its essential nature. Humans kept reinventing uses for it, and mercury, in return, kept delivering its brand of glittering usefulness paired with quiet, lingering harm. It was a strange relationship, half partnership, half slow-motion disaster, and by the mid-20th century, the world was finally beginning to acknowledge the imbalance. Yet mercury had one more unexpected era of influence ahead of it, and this time, the setting was modern enough to make the story feel uncomfortably familiar. The 20th century was the age of convenience, glowing neon lights, industrial chemistry, and household appliances humming politely in the background. Mercury was woven into all of it, not always obviously, but reliably, as dependable as a minor character who somehow appears in every episode of a long-running show. Fluorescent lighting, for instance, relied on mercury vapor. It still does in many places. When electrified, that vapor emits ultraviolet light, which then hits a phosphor coating inside the tube, and produces the familiar glow. It was a technological miracle when it first appeared, bright, efficient, and far less expensive than older lighting methods. Office buildings, schools, and factories adopted fluorescent lights in enthusiastic waves. No one thought much about the mercury sealed inside the tube. It wasn't that people didn't know it was dangerous. They just trusted the glass to keep it contained. This trust was a little optimistic, considering how frequently things in life break. School janitors, for instance, became accidental mercury handlers when bulbs shattered during lunchtime dodgeball mishaps. Most cleanup guidance was somewhere between vague and non-existent. People swept up the shards, maybe wore gloves if they were feeling cautious, and tossed the debris into regular trash bins. Mercury vapor drifted invisibly into the air, doing what it had done for millennia, moving quietly into human bodies without any dramatic entrance. Even outside lighting, mercury found new lives in surprising places. Mercury switches, small devices that relied on a drop of the metal rolling back and forth, were widely used in thermostats and electrical appliances. They were simple, reliable, and nearly impossible to destroy. If you shake an antique thermostat today, you might hear a faint metallic click inside, a tiny echo of an earlier technological philosophy. If it works, don't worry too much about the poison. At the same time, mercury continued to haunt the world of mining, particularly small-scale gold extraction. Artisanal miners, often working independently or in informal communities, used mercury to bind with gold particles and form an amalgam. Heating the amalgam released the mercury as vapor and left behind purified gold. The technique required no fancy equipment, which made it extremely appealing. Unfortunately, no fancy equipment also meant no ventilation, no protective gear, and no real way to avoid exposure. Families, including children, breathed in the fumes as they worked. Mercury settled into the soil, washed into streams, accumulated in fish, and made its way back into the bodies of people who weren't even involved in mining. The entire process resembled a loop, a rather depressing one, in which mercury traveled from earth to air to water and back into human life. Miners earned income to support their families, but the cost echoed quietly through their communities, visible only in symptoms that emerged gradually: shaking hands, slowed movement, difficulty with coordination. The tragedy wasn't always dramatic. It was slow, quiet, and terribly familiar. In many ways, it replayed the patterns seen at Almaden centuries earlier. The geography changed, the chemistry did not. Meanwhile, scientists kept uncovering new ways in which mercury interacted with the world. They learned, for instance, that in aquatic environments, certain bacteria could convert inorganic mercury into methyl mercury, a form that moved easily through food chains. Fish absorbed it, larger fish absorbed more of it, and predators at the top accumulated the highest concentrations. This was bad news for ecosystems, and for humans who enjoyed seafood. When researchers tested mercury levels in large predatory fish, tuna, swordfish, and sharks, they detected concentrations high enough to raise concern. Governments issued consumption advisories. Nutritionists promoted smaller fish. Environmentalists pointed out, with some frustration, that the mercury in those fish often originated from industries thousands of miles away. The situation felt like a strange environmental version of déjà vu. Mercury had once again demonstrated its remarkable talent for traveling, accumulating and refusing to stay politely in one place. And in the midst of all this, Mercury still managed to touch the lives of historical elites, not because they were using mercury directly anymore, but because the artifacts they left behind carried traces of it. Museum conservators working on royal paintings, tapestries, manuscripts, and even ceremonial garments sometimes discovered vermilion pigments or mercury-treated fabrics. Handling such materials required caution. Gloves, ventilation, and specialized training became part of the profession. It was a curious thought. The same pigment once used to honor emperors now required modern scientific protocols to protect museum workers. History has a way of turning the glamorous into the hazardous, given enough time. Even older royal medical records revealed quiet, uncomfortable details. The treatments prescribed to monarchs in earlier century, ointments, purgatives, tonics, often contained mercury in various forms. Court physicians, armed with confidence and limited information, had treated ailments with substances we now recognize as harmful. When historians analyze letters and journals from the period, they sometimes identify symptoms that align suspiciously well with mercury exposure. Tremors described politely as nervous disposition, irritability labeled as temperament, sensory issues explained as melancholy or vapors. The records don't always name mercury explicitly, but the context is hard to ignore. Nobles who relied on fashionable treatments might have suffered consequences quietly, without realizing the cause. Their ailments became part of the private gossip of courts, woven into political speculation, when in reality they may have been side effects of a shimmering metal that never quite told the truth about itself. And then came dentistry. Again, mercury amalgam fillings were, oddly enough, one of the more successful uses of the metal. They were durable, long-lasting, and less expensive than gold. By the mid-20th century, millions of people worldwide had mercury fillings. Dentists assured patients that the mercury was safely bound within the alloy. This was mostly true, at least compared to earlier medical uses, but debates continued. Some people insisted the fillings were dangerous. Others argued they were perfectly safe. The arguments were, in their own way, a modern echo of ancient beliefs. Mercury had always inspired strong opinions, because it had always inspired both admiration and fear. By the 1990s, global discussions about mercury intensified again. Scientific research gained momentum. Environmental organizations raised alarms. Policymakers convened committees. The world slowly recognized that mercury contamination wasn't just a series of isolated incidents. It was a worldwide issue, centuries in the making. The element had circulated through human society for so long that undoing the damage would take generations. In response, the international community created the Minamata Convention on Mercury, an agreement designed to reduce emissions, phase out certain mercury-based products, and manage contaminated sites. It took years of negotiation, but the treaty entered into force, marking a rare moment of global unity against a shared environmental threat. The symbolism was hard to miss. After thousands of years of entanglement, humanity was finally ready to define boundaries with mercury, to set limits and protections, to acknowledge the cost of its long, shimmering presence. And still, mercury remained in unexpected corners. Antique barometers sat in collectors' homes. Broken thermometers hid in old drawers. The cinnabar carvings from medieval China gleamed softly in museum cases. Somewhere, in a remote mining camp, a small vial of mercury was being rolled between someone's fingers because it looked beautiful when it moved. The world had changed, but mercury's allure had not. It continued to capture curiosity, a dangerous charm that was hard to shake. Throughout history, mercury shaped human lives in ways large and small, glamorous and devastating. It adorned emperors and poisoned workers. It illuminated cities, and contaminated rivers. It advanced science and eroded health. It was, in every sense, a mirror, liquid and literal, reflecting humanity's endless willingness to embrace beauty first and consequences later. And as the 20th century unfolded into the 21st, Mercury's story remained unfinished, its shimmering trail weaving through technology, medicine, culture, and memory. Humans had finally learned to respect it, but not quite to let it go. The relationship continued, quieter now, more cautious, more regulated, yet unmistakably present, and with Mercury still lingering in the background of modern life. It became clear that the metal story wasn't just about science or industry. It was increasingly a story about people, how they lived, what they valued, how they made decisions, and how they coped with the unintended consequences of their own ingenuity. Mercury found its way into the quiet corners of human experience, shaping habits, fears, daily routines, and in more cases than anyone wanted to admit, long-term health. The metal had followed humanity through every major shift in civilization, and in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, it continued slipping into places where practicality overshadowed caution. Take, for example, the world of medicine. Even after mercury-containing treatments were phased out, the metal persisted in small, specialized applications. Certain antiseptics, such as thimerosal, included ethyl mercury, a compound used in extremely low concentrations to prevent bacterial contamination. It served a real purpose, especially in multi-dose containers stored in areas where refrigeration wasn't guaranteed. Its use was eventually reduced out of heightened public concern, rather than scientific necessity. And while the transition helped calm anxious communities, the episode revealed something interesting. Mercury had become a symbol of mistrust. For the first time in thousands of years, people weren't drawn to Mercury's shimmer, they were wary of it. Cultural perception had shifted from fascination to suspicion, a sort of collective awakening that perhaps the metal's charm had always been a little misplaced. Meanwhile, environmental scientists continued uncovering Mercury's global footprint. They found it in peat bogs, soil layers, and ice cores. Natural archives quietly recording centuries of human activity. The layers of mercury trapped in polar ice told a story of industrial growth, rising steadily through the 19th century, peaking in the mid-20th, then slowly declining as regulations took hold. Nature, it seemed, kept the receipt even in places untouched by factories or mining. Mercury had drifted on the wind, settling softly into the landscape. That drifting quality wasn't just poetic, it shaped policy in complicated ways. Nations realized that one country's emissions could become another country's contamination, which made Mercury both everyone's problem and no one's responsibility. Diplomatic discussions reflected this tension. Some countries, particularly those with long industrial histories, faced pressure to repair past damage. Others argued that they were still developing economically and shouldn't be held to the same standards. Mercury, without meaning to, became a symbol of global inequality, another thread tying environmental history to political reality. In the midst of this complexity, another field stepped unexpectedly into the spotlight: archaeology. Excavations around the world kept uncovering Mercury in contexts no one anticipated. Ancient Chinese tombs, for instance, often contained cinnabar, used ceremonially, leaving high concentrations in the surrounding soil. Archaeologists working near the unexcavated tomb of Qin Shi Huang detected mercury vapors, strong enough to suggest that the old legends about mercury rivers weren't exaggerated. They responded by re-evaluating excavation plans, leaning toward caution. Apparently, after 2,000 years, the emperor's obsession with immortality was still complicated. Elsewhere, In pre-Columbian sites across Mesoamerica, researchers found traces of Mercury in ritual spaces. The Maya, like the Chinese, used cinnabar extensively in burials and offerings. The pigment symbolized life and power, but residue from ancient ceremonies lingered in the earth. In some cases, soil readings prompted archaeologists to adjust their handling protocols, on protective gear, and rethink long-term exposure risks. It was a quiet reminder that the decisions of ancient elites, made for beauty, symbolism, or spiritual meaning, could still influence the health of modern researchers carefully brushing dirt from their artifacts. Europe had its share of archaeological Mercury as well. Medieval manuscripts painted with vermilion continued to shed microparticles as pigments aged. Conservators approached them with a mix of admiration and caution, treating every restoration project as both an artistic and chemical undertaking. Royal portraits from the Renaissance, brushed with mercury-rich vermilion to highlight cheeks, fabrics, and ornamentation, required similarly delicate handling. Over time, some pigments darkened to a brownish hue. As mercury compounds degraded, a visual reminder of chemical instability that no one in the 16th century could have predicted. Beyond archaeology and conservation, Mercury drifted through modern culture in subtler ways. Many people had old thermometers or barometers tucked into drawers or hanging on walls, unaware that these heirlooms contained enough mercury to require special disposal. Antique stores occasionally displayed mercury-backed mirrors, their reflective surfaces slowly mottling with age. Some homeowners proudly displayed old scientific instruments filled with mercury, unaware that a single crack could require professional cleanup. The metal hadn't disappeared from daily life. It had simply faded into the background, camouflaged by nostalgia. And then there were the lingering occupational risks. Dental offices, transitioning away from amalgam fillings, had to adopt new disposal protocols. Laboratories maintained sealed, ventilated areas for handling small amounts of mercury still used in niche research. Workers at fluorescent lamp recycling facilities wore protective gear to avoid inhaling vapor released from broken bulbs. Mercury hadn't vanished from the workplace. It had just become a substance that required rules, vigilance, and training, something that never blended well with human impatience. Yet, even as regulations tightened and awareness grew, certain communities continued relying on mercury for economic survival. Artisanal gold miners in parts of Indonesia, Peru, and Ghana knew the risks, but faced few alternatives. Gold extraction provided immediate income where opportunities were scarce, and mercury made the process possible with simple tools and basic skills. Outside organizations offered training and safer mining methods, but adoption was slow. People who needed money immediately couldn't always prioritize long-term health. Mercury once again slipped into the cracks of inequality, an old pattern repeating itself with modern urgency. The quiet tragedy of artisanal mining wasn't just the miners' exposure, it extended to their families. Mercury vapor released during amalgam burning settled into homes. Mercury runoff contaminated rivers where children played. Fish, often a primary food source, accumulated methyl mercury, transferring the risk from miners to entire communities. The cycle was predictable and heartbreaking, livelihood intertwined with poison, necessity overpowering caution. It echoed the experiences of silver miners in colonial Potosi centuries earlier, though this time it unfolded without empire's direct oversight. History, unfortunately, didn't require colonial administrators to repeat itself. Meanwhile, in the broader world, mercury became a symbol in new conversations about environmental justice. Activists pointed out that communities most affected by mercury contamination were often those with the fewest resources to address it, whether it was subsistence fishing villages near industrial sites, mining communities deep in forests, or neighborhoods near outdated waste facilities. Mercury had an uncanny ability to settle where oversight was weakest. The metal didn't discriminate, but human systems did, and mercury followed those systemic gaps with quiet precision. Despite all this complexity, there were glimmers of progress. The Manamato Convention spurred countries to phase out mercury-based products, modernize industrial processes, and monitor environmental levels more carefully. Schools replaced mercury thermometers with digital alternatives. Hospitals switched to mercury-free devices. Researchers developed new methods to track mercury in ecosystems. Environmental restoration projects slowly reclaimed contaminated sites, but perhaps the most interesting shift was psychological. For the first time in recorded history, the world viewed mercury primarily as a problem to be solved rather than a tool to be admired. The cultural narrative had reversed. Mercury had once symbolized transformation, beauty, healing, even immortality. Now it symbolized contamination, negligence, and the long tail of industrialization. It was an element humans finally approached with weariness rather than awe, and yet mercury retained a strange poetic quality. Its liquid form, mesmerizing and alien, continued to fascinate anyone who glimpsed it. Even knowing its dangers, people found it hard not to stare. It was a reminder that human attraction to beauty is persistent, even when that beauty carries risk. A reminder that curiosity often outpaces caution. A reminder that progress is rarely a straight line. The long relationship between humanity and mercury was never simple. It shaped royal courts, fueled empires, illuminated cities, sickened workers, inspired artists, and challenged scientists. It traveled through soil, air, water, and memory, and just when people thought they had left it behind, it resurfaced in a new context, carrying the same shimmering allure and the same quiet danger. By the 21st century, mercury was no longer a common household companion, but it remained woven into the fabric of the world historically, environmentally, culturally. The past had left a metallic footprint that modern society was still learning how to navigate, and the metal itself, unchanged across all these eras, testified to one simple truth. Humans have always been drawn to things that glisten, even when they glisten a little too brightly, and the closer we drift toward the present day, the more mercury begins to look like a mirror. Not a metaphorical one, though it works that way too, but a literal echo of all the choices humans have made over thousands of years. You could argue that mercury has done nothing new in all this time. It vaporizes, condenses, binds to gold, reflects light, slips between fingers, poisons nerves, and gleams exactly the same way it did when the first ancient miner cracked open cinnabar ore. The only thing that changed was the scale on which humans insisted on using it. The world, meanwhile, absorbed the consequences quietly, the way it absorbs almost everything we do, at least at first. By the 21st century, mercury had become a kind of environmental time capsule. Scientists studying deep ocean sediments or high-altitude snow layers found traces that matched industrial peaks, decades when entire nations churned out chemicals, mined ores, and refined metals at a pace never seen before. Each layer told its own subdued chapter. A bit of mercury from early mining here, a spike from the Industrial Revolution there, a dramatic rise during mid-20th century chemical manufacturing, then finally a gradual decline. as regulations began settling into place. Nature doesn't speak often, but when it does, its handwriting is very tidy. Of course, tidy handwriting doesn't necessarily comfort anyone living in the present. Mercury contamination persists in thousands of places worldwide. Lakes, bays, riverbeds, floodplains. Many of these sites sit near former industrial corridors, often in communities that had little political power when the factories were running, and only slightly more now that cleanup is overdue. The metal settles in sediment like a stubborn memory. Every storm stirs a little of it loose again, as if the environment itself were reluctant to forget. And while most people today don't handle Mercury directly, they still interact with its legacy in quiet ways. Fish consumption advisories are one example. Many coastal regions, especially those near historic or current industrial zones, post notices warning people, especially pregnant women, about methylmercury levels in local species. These advisories tend to be calm and bureaucratic in tone, the informational equivalent of a gentle pat on the arm. But behind that tone sits centuries of chemical persistence. The fish aren't doing anything wrong, they're simply participating in the longest, most involuntary recycling program on Earth. Communities that rely on fishing for food or livelihood face the hardest choices. Telling people to avoid fish isn't very helpful when fish are a primary protein source or the backbone of the local economy. The problem isn't the fish. The problem is the long trail of mercury left upstream, sometimes literally upstream, sometimes metaphorically upstream, in the form of global emissions drifting across continents. Environmental justice efforts have pushed for better cleanup, stricter regulations, and more support for affected communities. Progress is slow, but the awareness at least exists now, more visible than before. And yet, Mercury's cultural presence still lingers. People inherit antique barometers from grandparents and don't realize the instruments contain liquid metal. Some collectors display old mercury glass ornaments from the 19th century, admiring their shimmer under soft lighting. Artists study Renaissance techniques involving vermilion pigment, handling the materials with careful gloved hands while quietly hoping no one sneezes. Museum workers, in particular, have developed a deeply practical respect for mercury. Many artifacts, from masks to manuscripts to decorative boxes, contain cinnabar or mercury-treated surfaces. A piece that once adorned the chambers of a Ming emperor or the dressing room of a European duchess may now require a hazardous materials protocol before it's gently nestled into archival foam. Sometimes, the traces appear in unexpected places. In archaeological digs in Europe, mercury residues show up in medieval medical kits. In colonial-era shipwrecks recovered off Caribbean coasts, divers occasionally find small metal flasks filled with mercury, once used for refining precious metals or for medicinal concoctions at sea. Researchers handle these finds with the kind of cautious fascination normally reserved for mythical artifacts, objects that glow faintly with historical significance and chemical hazard at the same time. Even fabrics tell stories. In some royal wardrobes preserved from the 18th and 19th centuries, conservators have identified mercury-based compounds used to treat certain dyes or preserve certain textures. The clothes, shimmering under museum lights, retain their beauty, but also their risk. Curators lift them carefully, as if centuries of elegance have congealed into something both fragile and slightly menacing. It's a strangely fitting metaphor for the old aristocracies, glamorous, but not quite safe to handle directly. And while mercury has largely disappeared from medicine, there are corners of the world where traditional remedies still incorporate it. usually in rituals or powders linked to cultural beliefs about purification or vitality. These practices are not inherently malicious. They're the continuation of long, interwoven traditions. But the health risks are real, and efforts to reduce mercury use often require cultural sensitivity, not blunt prohibition. People are more likely to adapt their traditions when they feel respected, not lectured. Mercury, unfortunately, does not wait patiently for cultural transitions, but people must navigate the transition at their own pace. Mercury also lingers in the scientific world in one of its most subtly persistent roles: calibration. Some high-precision instruments still use mercury because alternatives introduce slight measurement errors. Scientists, being scientists, care about those slight errors. They treat mercury with immense care, storing it in sealed systems with fume hoods, sensors, and locked cabinets. In these contexts, mercury becomes a kind of senior member of the lab, respected, slightly feared, and kept behind layers of containment like an eccentric uncle who is brilliant at math but shouldn't be allowed near a stove. But while scientists handle mercury with caution, many people still encounter it in less controlled situations, often accidentally. Discoveries of forgotten mercury jars in home workshops happen often enough that emergency services in some cities maintain specific mercury response kits. Old schools and municipal buildings sometimes reveal cracked gauge systems during renovation, prompting brief evacuations and a lot of paperwork. Most episodes are low-level hazards, but they demonstrate how thoroughly mercury embedded itself in the built environment long before modern safety standards existed. And then there's the strange, lingering presence of mercury in the world's waterways, not just from industrial sources, but from deep natural stores disturbed by mining, erosion, and even climate change. As permafrost melts in northern regions, small quantities of naturally occurring mercury emerge in streams and soils where they've been locked away for millennia. It's not a disaster in itself, but it's a reminder that Mercury's story started long before humans noticed its shine. We merely accelerated it, fast-forwarded it, spread it around in ways no glacier ever would. Perhaps the most quietly tragic part of Mercury's modern story involves wildlife. Birds at the tops of food chains accumulate mercury in their tissues. Some exhibit altered behaviors, sluggish reaction times, difficulty caring for young, disorientation. Scientists observe these patterns with a detached sadness, aware that ecosystems absorb harm differently than humans do. A single contaminated river can affect multiple species for generations, long after the original source has shut down or the company responsible has gone out of business. Mercury teaches its lessons slowly and often too late for immediate correction. And yet, what stands out most in Mercury's modern chapter is not catastrophe, it's endurance. People keep finding ways to adapt, mitigate, regulate, and educate. Industrial processes evolve. Communities develop safer alternatives. Scientists trace contamination with increasing precision. Governments negotiate international agreements. Mercury is still here, but it is no longer welcomed with admiration or blind trust. Humanity has grown, if nothing else, more careful. The relationship has shifted from fascination to wary respect. There's an irony in that transformation. For most of history, humans saw Mercury as a path to mastery over disease, over materials, over transformation itself. The alchemists believed mercury was fundamental to the structure of metals. Doctors believed it could purge impurities. Artisans believed it gave brilliance to their works. Industrialists believed it unlocked wealth. But in the end, Mercury mostly revealed how interconnected the world is, how choices ripple outward, how beauty and danger often coexist, and through this long, shimmering relationship, the metal never lied. It behaved consistently, predictably, impersonally. If anything, Mercury exposed human tendencies more than it caused them. Our attraction to shine, our desire to manipulate the natural world, our tendency to assume we understand something fully just because we've observed it closely. In the 21st century, Mercury's influence is quieter, but no less telling. It sits in regulations, in cautionary tales, in museum storage rooms, in international treaties. It remains in the fish warnings near coastal towns and in the protective gloves worn by archivists, turning the pages of centuries-old books. It hangs in the air of remote mining camps and sleeps in the sediments of lakes reflecting peaceful skies. And although Mercury has shaped empires, industries, sciences, and stories, its most enduring contribution might be the reminder it leaves behind, a subtle, persistent nudge to treat the world with more humility than our ancestors often managed. After all, the metal didn't change. We did, and perhaps that's the quietest triumph of this entire glittering, hazardous, strangely human saga. And as the story winds toward its quieter ending, Mercury continues to hover in the air of history like a faint metallic scent, easy to overlook if you aren't paying attention, but unmistakable once you notice it. It's strange, really, how one element can thread itself through so many eras, shaping the intimate details of lives separated by centuries, from alchemists in candlelit rooms to workers in roaring factories. From royal dressing tables to remote riverbanks, Mercury has been both companion and hazard, admired and feared, embraced and regulated. It never claimed to be anything other than what it was. Humans, on the other hand, spent millennia projecting all sorts of wishes, anxieties and inventions onto it. By the modern era, Mercury had taken on a role it had never played before, a kind of historical lesson. Not the dramatic, textbook kind, more the gentle nudge that arrives after you see the same pattern repeated enough times to recognize it instantly. The pattern usually goes like this. Humans discover something exciting. Humans use it everywhere. Unintended consequences begin to emerge. Humans deny the problem. Denial becomes inconvenient. Regulation eventually happens. Society moves on slightly smarter than before. Mercury followed this arc so faithfully it could almost qualify as the template. Yet, despite the familiar arc, Mercury's final chapters carry a kind of reflective softness. Many harmful substances from history simply vanished when people abandoned them. But Mercury didn't vanish. It lingered in soil, in sediments, in fish, in museum collections, in archaeological layers, in antique hardware. It remained present enough to remind people that environmental art doesn't operate on human timelines. What we disperse doesn't simply disappear because we lose interest. Some of the most poignant reminders appear in museums. Curators opening centuries-old storage chests, or unraveling embroidered robes from once glittering courts, occasionally discover that the shimmering reds and oranges came from cinnabar. The dye may have faded, but the mercury hasn't. When staff don gloves, adjust airflow, and proceed with caution, they're engaging in a kind of time-bridging moment. The rituals of long-dead elites, emperors, kings, queens create modern procedures, safety protocols, and training modules. History is rarely that hands-on, but Mercury makes it so. The same is true for ancient text. Illuminated manuscripts from medieval monasteries and Renaissance workshops often contain vermilion pigments. Conservators working on these books sometimes describe a faint medicinal smell, not strong enough to alarm, but distinct enough to mark the presence of a substance that was once valued for its color rather than its chemistry. They handle the pages slowly, mindful that too much abrasion can release microscopic particles. In a strangely poetic way, the brilliant hues that once signified luxury now require the kind of protective attention once reserved for royalty. Even archaeology offers its share of quiet surprises. When ancient tombs or ceremonial sites reveal high mercury levels in the soil, researchers pause excavation not out of superstition but safety. In China, where legends of mercury rivers in imperial tombs might have once sounded fantastical, scientific readings now indicate that the soil indeed contains unusually high concentration. Archaeologists take that information seriously, treating the landscape like a place where history has quietly pooled in chemical form. The grand symbolism of emperors who sought immortality now coexists with the practical challenge of safely exploring the past they left behind. Meanwhile, in the natural world, Mercury continues its slow circulation. In deep lakes with low oxygen levels, sediments store mercury in quiet, layered time capsules. In forests near former industrial sites, mushrooms can accumulate surprising concentrations. In wetlands, mercury can transform into methylmercury, moving up food chains with the indifferent precision of chemistry doing what chemistry does. None of this is dramatic. Mercury rarely acts with the sudden violence people often associate with environmental disasters. Instead, it behaves like an old habit, small, repetitive, and persistent. Communities affected by mercury contamination often experience this persistence firsthand. In some fishing towns, older residents recall a time when no one thought twice about eating large predatory fish, when dinner was a matter of familiarity rather than risk assessment. Now younger generations grow up with advisories on which species to avoid. The shift is subtle but telling. Mercury reshaped local traditions, not by force but by accumulation. It's a reminder that environmental history is deeply personal, woven into culture and memory, not just policy. And in mining regions, especially areas touched by artisanal gold production, Mercury's influence unfolds in ways that feel disturbingly reminiscent of earlier centuries. Miners kneel beside riverbeds, mix mercury into pans of sediment, heat the amalgam over open flames, and breathe the fumes. The technique isn't modern or efficient, but it is accessible and immediate, everything that survival work tends to require. International programs offer training on safer methods, but adoption is slow. When faced with the choice between a theoretical risk and a practical livelihood, people often choose the latter. Mercury, being patient, slips into their bodies without argument. These modern echoes bring something else into focus. Mercury's story has always been intertwined with class. Elites used mercury in cosmetics, medicines, paints, and rituals without fully experiencing the worst consequences. The people who mined it, refined it, or burned it were the ones who suffered first and most. Even today, the pattern holds. Communities with fewer resources bear a disproportionate share of Mercury's legacy. Coastal villages near polluted bays, miners in remote hills, neighborhoods near outdated industrial plants. They all carry burdens that wealthier regions manage to avoid or outsource. Mercury doesn't discriminate, but systems do, and the metal moves accordingly. Yet even with this inequality, there are moments of progress that feel almost quietly hopeful. International agreements have led to reductions in mercury emissions. New technologies provide safer alternatives in industry. Scientific monitoring has grown more precise. Communities have organized cleanup efforts for contaminated sites. Students learn about mercury as part of environmental education. growing up with an awareness previous generations lacked. Humanity may not always get things right the first or fifth time, but it does gradually learn. And learning, in Mercury's case, has been a long, winding process. More than almost any other substance, Mercury shows how deeply human behavior is shaped by curiosity, desire, convenience, and delay. We used it because it was beautiful, useful, abundant, and easy. We kept using it because change is hard, habits are stubborn, and consequences often unfold too slowly to command attention. And we finally confronted its dangers because, eventually, there was no way not to. There is something oddly comforting in the thought that Mercury, with all its shimmering danger, also helped push society toward better science, better regulations, and better environmental awareness. It forced collaboration across nations and disciplines. It inspired researchers to develop new analytical tools. It prompted industries to innovate safer methods. It helped transform environmentalism from niche activism into global policy. Mercury didn't intend any of this. It's simply an element, but its long, complicated relationship with humanity nudged us toward more thoughtful stewardship of the world. By the time the 21st century settled in, Mercury's role had shifted from active participant in daily life to lingering reminder. It sat in cautionary labels, in environmental advisories, in scientific protocols, in historical records. It showed up in textbooks as both a marvel and a warning. It appeared in documentaries about industrial pollution and in museum exhibits about alchemy. It rested quietly in sediment layers, scanning electron micrographs and diplomatic agreements. It reminded humanity, in its own subtle way, that progress demands attention, not just to innovation, but to aftermath. And maybe that's the most fitting end to Mercury's saga, not a dramatic banishment or a triumphant scientific achievement, but a slow, collective decision to be more careful. Mercury never changed. Humans simply grew more aware. The metal that once symbolized immortality became a symbol of responsibility. The substance, once associated with transformation, became a catalyst for reflection. And in the long, shimmering arc of history, that transformation might be the closest thing to alchemy humanity has ever achieved.